The storm rolled over the Appalachian ridgeline like a slow drumbeat, thunder echoing between the hollows as the sky darkened to an iron gray. I stood ankle-deep in the churned mud where my hunting cabin had once been, staring at a pile of splintered timber and broken cinder block. Smoke still curled from the smoldering wreckage where someone had torched the remains. This cabin wasn't just a shack in the woods. It had been mine, built with my own hands years ago, nestled in the quiet stillness of the forest where the world felt bearable again. A place of peace. And now it was gone. A laminated notice flapped in the rain, nailed to a splintered post that used to mark the porch. The red letters screamed through the water droplets: property seized and demolished, non-payment of HOA fees. Only one problem. This land didn't belong to their HOA. It belonged to me. And the people who thought they could intimidate, bully, and steal? They had no idea who they were dealing with. My name is Marshal Daniel Hayes, Deputy U.S. Marshal, to be exact. And the storm that had started in the sky was nothing compared to the one I was about to bring down on them. The smell of wet ash clung to my clothes as I crouched in the wreckage, running my calloused hands over the charred remains of what used to be my rifle rack. The rain had cooled most of the embers, but not the fire boiling inside me. I pulled out my phone, snapping pictures. Angles, timestamps, details. Evidence. My cabin sat on 30 acres of private land, surveyed and recorded at the county courthouse. I'd bought it outright 10 years back with cash from my first big assignment. It was mine legally and otherwise. So why the hell was an HOA from Ridgewood Pines, a cookie-cutter subdivision 2 miles down the mountain, posting notices here? My phone buzzed. Caller ID, Sheriff Tom Weaver. Hayes, Weaver said as soon as I answered, his voice carrying the weight of a man already tired of bad news. Heard about your cabin. You all right? I'm standing in the ruins, I said flatly. You want to explain how a homeowners association has the authority to tear down private property outside their jurisdiction? Weaver sighed. They don't. But they're loud, well-funded, and got themselves a hell of a lawyer. They've been making a push to extend their covenants past the Ridgewood line. Claim your land falls under Phase 2 expansion. I barked a humorless laugh. Phase 2? Sheriff, this land's been in my name for a decade. The deed's clean. Doesn't matter to them. They act first, bury people in court later. HOA president woman named Karen Ellison, she's been throwing her weight around. Bulldozed 3 properties last month, too. My grip tightened on the phone. So she's done this before. Yeah. But none of those folks wore a badge. I looked out over the clearing, rain dripping from my hat brim. He was right. I wasn't just some homeowner. I was a federal marshal. I didn't bend easy, and I didn't scare. I'll handle it, I said, and hung up. The next morning, I drove into Ridgewood Pines. The place was a caricature of suburbia: manicured lawns, SUVs in every driveway, and identical beige houses lined up like toy soldiers. At the gatehouse, a security guard in a cheap uniform stepped out, hand on his hip. Afternoon, sir. This is a private community. Name's Daniel Hayes. Here to see the HOA president. The guard squinted, then checked a clipboard. You got an appointment? No. But she'll want to see me. After a pause, he buzzed me through. I found the clubhouse at the center of the subdivision, a full brick monstrosity with white columns meant to mimic a courthouse. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over a polished meeting room. A woman sat at the head of a long table, laptop open, papers stacked neatly. Karen Ellison? I asked. She looked up, adjusting her pearl necklace. Her expression was the kind that had spent years getting its way. Yes. And you are? I stepped closer, letting the silence hang before I spoke. The man whose cabin you demolished. Her eyes flickered, but her smile stayed. Ah. That property. You failed to pay Ridgewood HOA fees for 7 consecutive years. Non-compliance results in forfeiture. It's all outlined in our bylaws. I set a folder on the table. Deed records. Survey maps. County plats. Your bylaws don't apply to me. My land isn't part of Ridgewood Pines. It never was. Karen didn't even glance at the papers. Our expansion plan included your parcel. You were notified. Notified? My voice sharpened. The only notice I ever got was the one you nailed to the ruins of my cabin. Behind her, 2 board members shifted uneasily. But Karen leaned back, her smugness unshaken. You can fight it in court if you wish, she said, folding her hands. But Ridgewood has resources. We always win. For a moment, I just looked at her, the hum of the lights filling the silence. Then I leaned down, my voice low, controlled. I don't think you understand who you're playing with. I'm a deputy U.S. Marshal. You've just committed destruction of private property, trespassing, and arson, federal crimes. And unlike your board, I don't bluff. Her smile faltered, just slightly. You'll be hearing from me again, I said, and walked out. That night, as I sat in my truck overlooking the black outline of the mountain where my cabin had been, I opened my laptop. My fingers moved with purpose, pulling property records, county filings, satellite overlays. Piece by piece, I built the case. But this wasn't just about legal paperwork anymore. It was about people like Karen Ellison, arrogant, entitled, convinced they could bulldoze over anyone too small to fight back. I wasn't small. As the rain started again, tapping against my windshield, I made myself a promise: Ridgewood Pines had started a war. And I intended to finish it. Morning came like a verdict. Cold, merciless light poured across Ridgewood Pines as if the subdivision itself wanted nothing obscured. I had slept in my truck at the county line, not trusting my house in town to feel like home after what had happened up on the mountain. When I pulled into the sheriff's office, Sheriff Tom Weaver handed me a paper coffee cup and a look that suggested 2 things: sympathy and impatience. You stirred up the whole valley, Danny, he said, using the name only old friends and colleagues got to use. Ellison's phone blew up last night. Board members calling, lawyers calling. She's already got a press release drafted accusing you of trespass and vandalism. They demolished my cabin, Tom. They burned my papers. I pushed back the hood of my jacket and dropped a folder on his desk. I want a warrant, search, seizure, anything we need to find who pulled the trigger. Tom rubbed his jaw. Federal crimes are messy when they tango with local politics. But you've got something they'll listen to. He tapped the folder. Recorded threats? Witnesses? Witnesses, I said. And a contractor. I'd spent the better part of last night chasing down the truck plate I'd seen leaving my property the day before the demolition, an old Ford with a contractor's magnet on the door. It led to a company called Harrington Site Services and a name that made my jaw tighten: Bradley Knox. Knox had a reputation in these parts, hands in a lot of dark pies. Contract work for people who preferred to keep no paper trail and even less conscience. By midday we moved. Sheriff Weaver assigned 2 deputies to ride with me to the Harrington yard. I called in a favor from the U.S. Attorney's Office for a federal search warrant, and they expedited it like the paperwork mattered less than the people. When we rolled up to the Harrington compound, a fenced lot of rusted equipment and peeling signs, Knox himself sauntered over like a man who'd been untouchable his whole life. Marshal Hayes, he drawled with an oily smile. Heard you had trouble with the Hill. Shame about that cabin. You participated in the destruction, I said. You signed off on the work. Where's the work order? Who paid you? Knox's smile turned thin. Work orders ain't my style. I got a call. A job's a job. A deputy produced the warrant. Knox's hands found themselves cuffed as we walked him to a cruiser. In his trailer office we found a binder, dozens of invoices marked paid, checks with signatures, and a stack of emails printed from an address: karen.ellison@ridgewoodpinchoa.com. The handwriting on the checks matched the signature on some HOA documents we'd later discover were backdated. Looks like we've got a paper trail, Tom said, flipping through pages. It's deeper than that, I told him. Underneath the invoices somebody had scribbled a list, street names, parcel numbers, and amount next to each. At the bottom, an acronym, CP and a name,
Commissioner Samuel Price.
Commissioner Price was the kind of man whose face had been on too many fundraising signs. He had money, reach, and a weak moral spine.
If Ridgewood's expansion plan matched Price's development interests, then the demolition wasn't just an HOA flex, it was a power play.
That night I drove back to the mountain to sift through what the rain hadn't consumed. The sheriff's men had collected what they could: the notice nailed to the post, a charred fragment of my cabin ledger, the remains of a propane tank hammered flat. What I couldn't let anyone yet know was that I'd also found a scrap of paper tucked beneath a rock, a scribbled GPS coordinate and the initials EB.
Ethan Bloom.
That name meant one thing: the slimy lawyer who did real estate guardianship for oligarchs of suburbia. He'd been spotted at Ridgewood meetings before, and his suit tailored for predation had a reputation of its own. I could smell the pattern: Karen pulls the strings, Price greases the route, Bloom does the lawyering to make the theft look legal.
And Harrington provides the muscle.
I don't like surprises, I like evidence. I like when facts gather like a jury and pronounce the truth without theatrics. So I started building my own case, quietly, cleanly. I subpoenaed bank records through the U.S. Attorney's Office, dug into county land filings, and called in a favor from an old friend at the State Environmental Agency to run a title search. Bits of crooked paper and off-the-books checks lit up like constellations, payments funneled through shell companies, a backdated easement signed by a phantom trustee, zoning waivers with signatures that didn't match the county's handwriting. The deeper I went, the more it looked like a crooked pipeline to rob people of land.
And then things got personal.
One evening, as I was poring over scanned documents in a booth at a diner that still served pie like it mattered, my laptop died with a soft finality. I reached for my backup charger and found it snipped clean, cord cut with deliberate, practiced hands.
Across the parking lot, someone in a dark SUV idled as the diner lights flicked.
I felt their eyes on me in the same freezing certainty I'd felt the night my cabin burned. They wanted to make me leave the fight. I slid the shredded cord into a paper bag, folded my hands, and finished my coffee.
Intimidation was nothing new. You get it in my line of work all the time. But this was escalation, the kind that means someone fears your next move because it'll expose them.
I called Sheriff Weaver.
They cut my charger. Someone's watching. There's a patrol out front, he said. We'll check the diner tapes. We found the SUV on the footage and unmarked Ford, plates swapped.
Halfway through the video, a figure in a hoodie exited the car and lingered near my booth, phone to his mouth. He hesitated like he wanted to come in, then drove off. No smile, no greeting. Just the pressure of more to come. If they were going to play at threats, I'd respond with truth. The next morning I scheduled a meeting with the U.S. Attorney and played the chain of evidence on a table like bones.
Bank transfers. Invoices signed by Karen.
A recorded phone call from a Harrington foreman admitting he'd been hired by the HOA president to clear disputed parcels.
A sinking realization settled into the room: this was not small-time theft. It was a campaign and engineered land grab.
You need a strategy, the U.S. Attorney said.
Public charges might get them to fight dirty. Civil suits could take years. But there's a quicker route: federal conspiracy charges.
If you tie the commissioner and the lawyer to a scheme to deprive proprietors of property through false instruments and arson, we can act fast.
We coordinated raids, search warrants drafted, grand jury subpoenas prepared.
I felt something like vindication, but it was tempered by a new fear: actions accelerate consequences. When you expose people with money and influence, they rarely go quietly. 2 days later, late and tired, I parked outside a tiny apartment where No's assistant, an ex-con named Mila Ortiz, lived. She'd been the one who whispered about meetings in Ridgewood's backrooms and left voicemails on Knox's burner phone complaining about unpaid overtime. She agreed to talk for a price, immunity, and a ride out of town. Mila's account was a slow drip of confirmation. Knox and his crew went in with bulldozers and documentation provided by Bloom's office, signed, notarized, and fabricated. Harrington cleared land at night when neighbors were asleep. Payment funneled through shell accounts, labeled as community improvement fees. Their arrogance, she said, came from knowing they were insulated by lawyers and politicians who didn't ask questions.
By the end of the week, subpoenas went to Commissioner Price, to Ethan Bloom's law firm, and to several Ridgewood board members.
The press smelled blood, local outlets wanted quotes, pundits sharpened their columns, and Ellison put out a statement painting herself as a defender of community standards. Her face was all facile concern, her voice on camera matched the pearls she liked to wear. "We follow due process," she said. "We regret any misunderstanding." Few believed it. In small towns, people know how power smells. I had one more move. Late at night I drove up to the burning line where my cabin had been and found, tucked into the roots of an overturned concrete block, an envelope swollen with damp. Inside, photos snapped quickly, someone's hand visible in one, taking a picture of my property ledger as it burned. On the back of one photo, a note in hurried script, handled by EB. It was enough to warrant an indictment in my stomach and a plan in my head. We'd built a case, motive, means, beneficiaries. Now the legal machinery would grind warrants, raids, indictments. They'd either crumble under the weight of their own corruption, or they'd lash out, and I had to be ready for both. That night, as I drove through the dark toward town, headlights cutting the black, my phone buzzed with a text from Sheriff Weaver. "We've got movement. Price requested a closed session meeting tonight." He's nervous. Sometimes the small victories arrive like quiet footsteps. The more noise you make, the louder the rats scurry. I imagine Commissioner Price sitting at his polished desk, the glow of a lamp throwing his hands long and gaunt. I imagine Karen Ellison pacing the Ridgewood clubhouse, convinced for the last time that paperwork could hide the moral rot. I also imagine the people who'd lost land, who'd watched a bulldozer roll through the shelter that kept their memories intact. They were the reason I'd become a marshal. To them, and to the memory of my own cabin, I had a duty to bring light to what the dark tried to swallow. The gears were in motion. The danger climbed higher. But for the first time since I'd found those smoldering timbers, the anger in me settled into something colder and more useful: focus. Justice was a process, not a verdict. And the process was about to begin its work. The courthouse smelled of polish and paper, that dry scent of bureaucracy trying to mask the rot it sometimes carried. Sunlight poured through tall windows, slicing across the wooden benches where townsfolk gathered like an audience hungry for justice. On the docket, State of West Virginia versus Ridgewood Pines HOA, Karen Ellison, Commissioner Samuel Price, and Attorney Ethan Bloom. But before the trial, before the headlines, there was the moment of truth. The night before. I couldn't sleep. I sat on the hood of my truck parked at the old cabin site, staring at the ashes that hadn't yet been washed away by rain. This wasn't just about my land anymore. It was about the people, neighbors who'd whispered to me in diners, farmers who'd shown me letters threatening foreclosure, veterans who'd shaken their heads and said they were too tired to fight. They all wanted Ridgewood stopped, but none of them had the badge or the teeth to do it. I did. I closed my eyes and thought of my father, who used to say, "A man's land is the last piece of earth that proves he belongs. Take that from him, and you take his roots." That was what Karen Ellison had stolen. That was what Price and Bloom had sold. Roots. I swore before the ashes that when the sun rose, the reckoning would begin. The raid. Federal warrants move like hammers. They don't knock, they strike. At 6 a.m., the marshals and sheriff's deputies rolled into Ridgewood Pines in unison. Black SUVs idled at the gates while tactical teams fanned out. Suburban joggers froze mid-stride, clutching their water bottles as armed agents filed past. Karen Ellison was pulled from her breakfast table in a silk robe, pearls still around her neck. Her protests carried down the cul-de-sac like the wail of a spoiled child. "This is unlawful. I represent Ridgewood Pines. I am Ridgewood Pines." Her laptop, seized. Her phones, bagged. Stacks of documents from her study, boxed and hauled away. Across town, Commissioner Price was still nursing last night's whiskey when the battering ram took his front door. He stumbled out, pale and stammering, cuffed before he could grab his burner phone. And in the glass tower downtown, Ethan Bloom adjusted his tie as if it could save him, insisting he was just counsel, just a lawyer, until the agents rolled out binders of forged deeds bearing his notary stamp. One by one, the dominoes fell. I wasn't on any of the teams. I stayed behind the line, arms folded, watching. My job wasn't to put the cuffs on. My job was to ensure the storm I'd unleashed didn't stop halfway.
The trial. The trial stretched 3 weeks, but the headlines wrote themselves from day one. Witness after witness testified. Contractors admitted they'd been paid off the books. Homeowners wept describing how bulldozers tore through their fences at midnight. Mila Ortiz, under protection, described the secret meetings in Ridgewood's clubhouse, how Bloom drafted false covenants while Karen barked orders. When the prosecutor dropped photos of my cabin burning, jury members shifted in their seats. Some shook their heads. Karen sat there every day, her pearl necklace gleaming, her expression a mask cracking little by little. Bloom scribbled notes furiously, his tie forever crooked. Price sweated through his suits. When I was called to the stand, the courtroom went still. I took the oath, looked at the jury, and told them everything. How I'd found my cabin burned. How I'd traced the trucks. How the evidence piled into a mountain too high to ignore. I didn't embellish. I didn't rage. I just laid the truth bare, like showing them scars that had already healed into conviction. The defense tried to paint me as biased, vengeful. But every time they jabbed, I answered with evidence, records, deeds, photos. My cabin wasn't the only casualty. It was just the first they'd picked on that fought back. By the time closing arguments came, the air was thick with inevitability. The verdict. On the 12th day of deliberation, the jury filed back in. We, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts. Conspiracy. Fraud. Destruction of property. Racketeering. Karen Ellison's face went ashen, her pearls hanging loose against her throat as if they'd strangled her. Price closed his eyes like a man watching his career crumble into dust. Bloom dropped his pen, no slick words left to spin. The gavel fell. The people in the gallery erupted, cheers, tears, the sound of relief long overdue. But I didn't cheer. I just let out the breath I'd been holding since the night I'd stood in the rain, staring at the ruins of my cabin. Justice wasn't about celebration. It was about restoration. Weeks later, Ridgewood Pines had a new board, its members court-appointed until elections could be held. Investigators froze Price's assets, and Bloom's law license was stripped. Karen faced a sentence she couldn't buy her way out of. But me? I drove back up the mountain. The land was scarred, blackened timbers scattered like bones. But it was still mine. My boots sank into the earth that had carried me through my worst days, the ground my father once called sacred. I brought lumber. Nails. A hammer that had calloused my palms years ago. Piece by piece, I started building again. Neighbors stopped by, men and women I barely knew, some with tool belts, others with casseroles, all with gratitude in their eyes. For standing up, they said. For fighting when we couldn't. One old farmer pressed my hand and whispered, "You gave us back our roots." The new cabin took shape slowly, but stronger this time. Every beam was set with care, every board nailed with intent. Not just a shelter, but a reminder. I never cared about HOA politics. I never cared about property lines beyond what was right and legal. But when someone tries to take what you've bled for, when arrogance thinks it can bulldoze truth, well, that's when men like me step in. As I stood on the new porch months later, the forest stretched green and endless before me. A hawk circled overhead, sharp against the blue sky. The storm had passed. The ashes of the old cabin had fed the soil, and from it something stronger had grown, not just wood and nails, but justice rooted deep. And if anyone ever tried again to take what wasn't theirs, they'd find out quick. I wasn't just a man with land. I was a federal marshal. And I didn't lose twice.